History has a history. It's something we're all familiar with as educators, but we tend to leave explicit discussion of this aspect of history out of our classrooms until students reach the senior years of high school. Once there, we might slowly introduce students to some of the ideas and language of historiography, but the complexity of the issues means that it's hard to deal in depth with this aspect of history in just the final year or two of school. So students often graduate from high school without a clear understanding of what historiography is or the skills to engage effectively when they're presented with varying interpretations of the past. And I think this is an increasingly essential skill for young people around the world. They need to be better equipped to identify not just the potential bias in the way people construct narratives about contested events in our past, but also the subtle, sophisticated ways that meaning is shaped, consciously and unconsciously, in the process of making history. I think there are a few reasons we don't tackle historiography with students earlier in their schooling. Our junior curriculum can be crowded with content, and the idea of adding anything else in seems impossible. We're busy dealing with more fundamental skills like literacy and comprehension, and teaching historiography can seem very time-consuming. An understanding of historiography just doesn't seem essential at this stage. But I think it's worth tackling this topic earlier with our students, because the language and thinking that students develop when they grapple with the changing nature of history gives them the skills to critically evaluate multiple historical perspectives and, more importantly, feel empowered to engage with the histories and historical perspectives that are important to them. Now, there's no one definition of historiography, and maybe the slightly vague nature of it also puts us off. But in practical terms, historiography is the history of how historical interpretation has changed over time. We actually all engage in historiographical debate regularly in our classrooms. Every time we argue about representations of the past, for example, in a debate about how an individual from the past should be remembered, we are evaluating differing interpretations from different times and places. Historiographical debates are the best kind. They can lead to passionate arguments about history and end up being the most engaging for our students. They're both engrossing because they don't have a right or wrong answer and because they matter for us in the present day. Historiographical discussion constantly surfaces in a way that is directly relevant to public debate. While we might be doing historiography in our junior classrooms, we probably aren't explicitly talking to students about it. But I think there are a few easy ways we can introduce younger students to historiography in ways they can understand, that help them build the knowledge and skills they will need later on when they're ready to tackle these big questions about history. I'm going to share 3 strategies I use in my classes that I found effective. The first is really simple. I label different approaches to history each time we use them and build a bank of history hats that we use to identify the approach of each secondary source we encounter. We compare the works of feminist historians with that of traditional national narratives or proponents of big history on questions such as the causes of the Industrial Revolution. And each time we encounter a different approach, we pause and discuss what this approach is, how and when it came about, and what influence it might have on the end product. We add any terms that we might need to talk about these approaches to our unit glossary, along with key terms from the topic. Alerting students to the different ways of approaching history, giving them the language to label these approaches, and helping them see the impacts this can have on the conclusions of the historian helps them become comfortable with the idea that history is not a fixed body of knowledge, but rather one which changes over time. A class a few years ago gave me a set of hats for Christmas that they decorated to represent their favourite historical approaches from our lessons. They might have taken me a bit literally, but they got the point. When people create history, they don't all do it the same way, and those differences matter. My second strategy does require a little more time, but I think it pays off in the long run. I dedicate class time at some point in each unit to a debate, which allows students to critically examine different perspectives. Often this is focused on a prominent individual, as they tend to be really polarizing in history. Students can clearly identify the different interpretations of someone like the ancient Chinese emperor Qin Shi Huangdi within a range of sources. We practice analysing these opinions to identify what type of history the author is writing and how the history hat they've chosen to wear might be influencing their work. We compare the works of Chinese historians writing national histories with social historians interested in the lives of the everyday people living under Qin's reign to draw out the ways in which history is shaped not just by the sources but also by the historians themselves. Posing these questions in a debate format allows students to consider what types of history they think are useful, effective, accurate, or even dangerous. The opportunity to consider how they think history should be constructed equips students to recognise when a historical narrative is being used to support an argument about their world and appraise the motives of the author. My third strategy involves giving students time to practice constructing history themselves using a hat of their choosing. I design a task where students choose an interesting historical question and answer that question. But rather than simply getting them to analyse sources and come to a conclusion, I have students first think about which approach to history would be the most useful for the question they have developed. I tend to do this activity with students who are already familiar with historiography and have had a bit of time engaging with our history hats, around Year 9 or 10. But I find it forces students to think like a historian, not just in the way they critically analyse sources, but also in the way they make decisions about the stories of the past they choose to tell. I've had students produce some amazing work using this activity: counterfactual histories of the space race, Marxist approaches to the Industrial Revolution, and a feminist analysis of Cleopatra VII. These three strategies can be adapted for use in the study of any history unit and embedded easily in the activities we already employ in our classrooms. But they can have a significant impact in equipping students to see history as a changing, living, contested discipline in which they can and should have an opinion, so that the next time they read an article which uses a particular construction of history to support an argument about the world today, they can pause and think twice about whether they agree.